It is sort of everywhere, isn't it?
It's, yeah, and it's not, one of our batteries was like beyond, not redeemable to charge.
River Styx.
I don't have that.
Yeah, so that was a nice one.
Is it saying metallic?
I think so, but I think it's a deeper color than that one.
Seems like it is.
Okay, hi. Welcome to Bible study. So this is our first in-person and live streamed Bible study. And we're going to go through the class I wrote that's called Hebrew Bible Genesis. The last time I taught this class was in 2022 here, I believe. And we put a lot of students through it. And so I'm glad to see that some of you are back. This is not easy information to remember. I want to warn you that the approach I take in this is a scholarly approach. This is what Bible scholars teach. So you're not going to go out of here with a new warm heart because you learned something great about Genesis, but you're going to be able to read the Bible on your own without stumbling over so many hurdles, if that makes sense. Of course, we are only going to be dealing with Genesis in this class, and we're not going to do all of it, but we're going to get started. So you had some homework this week, and if you don't have that homework and you want it, just email the church office at marshfieldumchurch@gmail.com, and they will send it to you by email. That homework helps. So let's talk about George Washington and the cherry tree. What is that story? Well, tell me the story, though. Tell me the story.
George Washington was a wee little boy, and he chopped down a cherry tree, and then he went and told on himself and confessed that he chopped down a cherry tree.
It's been a long time. Okay, we got to.
Did you chop down the tree? And he said, I cannot tell a lie.
Oh, I can't. It's the first grade teacher is agreeing. Okay, so there's a father that catches the son, and he says, I cannot tell a lie. Why do we teach our children that? When do we teach our children that story? Did you teach it in first grade, Tracy? Yep. And what is the moral lesson that kids get from that story? It's okay.
You hope that if they learn, even if you've done it, that's on the truth,
Even if you know you're getting in trouble, you have to tell the truth. Is that something that you feel is part of our national history? Or our national ethics? Without getting political, is this an American ideal? An ideal that this is who we are, and look where we get this story from our founding father, from our first president of the United States. I'm pointing at the dad, but it's the boy. Okay, that's why we teach that story. Did the story happen? Are you sure it didn't happen? We're not sure it didn't happen, but we think it probably didn't happen just like that, right? Does it matter? Did you tell your kids that story? Yeah, I did too. I think Tracy got to him before I did. So let's talk about what a myth is. A myth is a meaning-making story. It has significance beyond itself, and it helps listeners make sense of their lives. That's what a myth is. A myth is not a lie. A myth is a story that helps us make sense of our lives. It is a meaning-making story. It's not just an interesting story. It's a story that, now I get something bigger. I am not going to tell you that Genesis is myth. I'm not going to tell you that, but I will say that myth is often the word that scholars use, particularly for the stories in the beginning of Genesis, because the Jewish readers of these texts see them as meaning-making stories. Jewish readers do not read their own scriptures for fact. We read them for fact. They would read this and go, we read it and go, ooh, okay. So that's the definition of myth, and we will come back to it through the class. We don't always know if stories are factual or if they are, but we know when they are mythical. And mythical stories can be factual, but they don't have to be factual. Any questions yet? Okay. So the part of the Bible we're going to be talking about in this class is the Torah, or what the Bible often calls the law. Protestant scholars call it the Pentateuch, the 5 books. I try not to use that word because it cost me like $600 an hour to learn that word. All of the things we will discuss in class only apply to the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, but you will learn some principles in this class that will apply outside of these books. But I don't want you to get halfway through the class and go, well, what about Samuel? Oh, we're not talking about Samuel. We are not talking about Samuel. We're not talking about Psalms. We're not talking about Proverbs. We're talking about Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, but particularly in this class, we are only talking about Genesis, just Genesis. All right, so all through history, since the Hebrew scriptures have been bouncing around, who did tradition say wrote Genesis? Moses. Okay, so there's a problem with that. There's a couple problems with that. One problem is Moses could not write his own death. Right? Moses died, and then other stuff happened in the other books. But Moses was dead, right? So that's a little bit tough. The other thing is that Moses was very busy. There is never a scripture story where they went to get Moses because they needed food and he was scribbling in his tent, right? So Moses was lost in the wilderness for 40 years. That's not what Moses was doing. That's just the traditional idea. So there was a British philosopher you may have heard of called Thomas Hobbes, who said, he was the first to say, I don't think Moses actually wrote the Bible. And everyone went, oh, that was scandalous. And then following Thomas Hobbes, there was a Frenchman who had, raised Protestant, and then he left and became a priest. And he wrote a book in which he said, I think maybe Moses didn't write that on his own. There were 1,300 copies of his book printed, and only 6 survived the burning. So after that, scholars looked at the Bible, and we're talking about physicians, philosophers, mathematicians. It wasn't all separate. Like this guy was a professor of theology, but never of mathematics. They did a lot of the same things. And those folks were looking at the Bible and they were like, well, what's going to happen if I say what I think? My book's going to get burned. People got expelled from the priesthood. They got thrown out of Protestant churches for saying anything about this. Plus you've got, late 18 or 1700s, the world's basically on fire. You've got revolutions happening all over the place. The French Revolution, the American Revolution, in the colonies, like it was wild. And all of these people had a lot of new ideas. And so it was hard to say anybody but Moses. But here's what happened. What happened was someone realized that God is called different names in the same story. Sometimes God is called Yahweh, which is translated as Lord, right? Lord, all caps, but the ORD is lower caps usually. So Lord or Yahweh. And then sometimes God is just called God, which was translated from Elohim. And so these scholars started to realize that when the names of God were different, the names of other people were different too. Like sometimes Abram and Sarah, and sometimes Abraham and Sarah. And those aligned with the names of God being different. And then they started to realize that God acted different in the stories where God had different names. And so these two scholars started to think very separate from each other. Maybe there were two sources. Maybe there's a source that calls God Yahweh and a source that called God Elohim, and they had just different ideas. And then they published it and they said, and those guys gave Moses their notes, and then Moses wrote it from their notes, right? Because you can't just come out and say Moses didn't write it at that point. And so that developed into what was called the older documentary hypothesis. So people started to realize like the divine name was different, the language and style were different. There were contradictions and divergences within the text, meaning how many animals did Noah take on the ark? Pairs.
One pair.
But in the second story you read, how many did they take? Divergences and contradictions within the text. The rain fell for 40 days. It fell for 150 days. Divergences and contradictions within the text. How do you make sense of that? You see people just do all kinds of contortions to try to make all that work. But these scholars were like, wait a minute. When it's 150 days, it's one name of God. When it's 40 days, it's another name. Oh my goodness, something is going on. There's duplication and repetition of material. If you've ever read Genesis or any of the books in the Torah, you're like, did I not just read that? I just read a slightly different version of that story. What's up with that? And then there are a lot of like between these sections, there are sometimes sort of, what are the words used? Transition words. Like, and then over on the other side of the map, these kinds of words that show you different ideas have been put together. And so here we are, the scientific revolution is going on, the Enlightenment, people are starting to really think critically in a new way. And these scholars are going, I want to think critically about the Bible. And so they came up with this, this is what developed into documentary criticism. And then we got to the four-source hypothesis. So in the late second half of the 1800s, there were two German scholars named Graf and Wellhausen. And they worked together. Wellhausen died in 1918. So that's exactly how old this, I mean, this was like late 1800s. And they said, okay, there were two sources. And then there was another source that took those two sources and put them together and added to them. And then there's another source that put it all together. And that's how the Bible was written. And everyone went, oh, and this is the prevailing theory today. So since the late 1800s, this idea, now it has changed. A lot of work has been done on it. They've got really clear ideas now. Well, they can debate it all day about which verse is which and what is the exact timing and what is this clue. But this is the basic theory. This is about as far as I went with it. As soon as we got to the four source hypothesis, this makes it make sense for me. So that's what I'm going to be teaching you is the four source hypothesis. This is not new. Like I've had people say, I can't believe you're teaching us all this newfangled Bible stuff. 1853. Like this is Civil War era. This is something every one of your pastors has learned in seminary. They don't always teach it. I sat in class with people in seminary in 2003 when I took this class and that led me to teach this. And people were like, I will never, ever teach this in my church because this will ruin people's faith. This will make people run out of the church screaming. I have had just the opposite experience. I think people have noticed these things and wondered and maybe didn't know if they could ask. They got nervous. And I've seen people go, ooh, I don't know if I can believe because I see contradictions and divergences within the text. And I want to say, just give me 10 minutes. I will tell you how you are right. And God is still good. Okay, so the four source hypothesis. Let's take a minute and make sure we don't have any questions. We've got a whole camera for Ken. A whole camera. Somebody's got to ask a question through Ken. Anything online? No chat questions? Okay. All right, let's go. So we're going to talk about, I'm not going to rip through all the sources today. I'm going to put you through one source. Okay, you got 5 weeks of class. Guess how many sources you're going to learn each week? One. Okay, until the point that you can actually look at a story and go, that smells like this source. Okay, just a little bit. You don't have to know this to read the Bible, but knowing about it helps you understand what you're reading in the Bible. So there are, in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, we call that the prehistory. Those are the early stories. There's not a lot of detail, timing. I mean, there's some, but it's like in the month of Noah's life. Oh, thanks. In the year of our Lord, we don't have that yet. So, it's pretty campfire stories about where we came from. And in those sources, in that part of the Bible, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, there are only two sources talking. So that's why I want us to start. And let me tell you, the flood story is easier to start with than the creation story. So we're going to do flood story this week. Then we're going to go to one of the creation stories next week as you learn about the second source. Yes, starting with the flood, going to creation. So the deal with the flood stories is that they are intermingled. They are interlocked. And so your readings for this week, what I did was I unlocked them. I gave you the story from one source and the story from another source. In the creation stories, it's one story followed by another story. So it's different. So I want you to understand the interlocking first. So the first source you need to know is the Yahwist. We call it the J source because in German, Yahwist is written Jahve. So it was the J source. These were German scholars. And so in that text, God is called YHWH. That is the tetragrammaton. That is the 4-letter word that means God. Okay? YHWH, what we say is Yahweh, which is translated Lord in the NRSV and the NIV, although I didn't spell it with caps like I should have. Okay, so that's always Lord. In one of your readings, was the name of God always Lord? Yes. Yes. Okay. And so the handy thing about the Yahwist, which is what they call the source, is that a person? Is it a group of people? We don't know. I don't know. It was a long time ago. The symbol, okay, so that is also associated with the south, Judah. Judah's the south, Israel's the north. So it's helpful because it's the southern source. So it's J Yahwist, but also J Judah. J focuses on the southern kingdom. Now, in these prehistory stories, there is no southern kingdom. There's no southern kingdom till, the Davidic and Solomon period. So what we mean is when it references the southern places is if it tells you a story of, and we went all over the land, they're not telling you about these towns. They're telling you about these towns. If I tell you I went all over the United States, I went to Nashville, I went to Atlanta, and I went to New Orleans, and I went to Phoenix, you'd be like, yeah, you just went to the cities in the South, right? So that's what they do, is they're just always, well, no, I didn't mention Hawaii, right? That's a good point, Carl. So focusing on the South, okay? And you can tell that Jerusalem is important. Of course, Jerusalem is the capital of Judah or the South. And Jacob gives his fatherly blessing to Judah. So this is all about the South. That's what you got to know. This is the Southern story. Who had the money and the power between Israel and Judah? The South, Judah. They had the temple, they had the king, they had all the power. And so this is the power story. That's something to keep in mind. This is where the power's at. But Jay has the distinct flavor of folklore. This is thought to be the earliest source, maybe written in the time of David or Solomon, is when this would have been written down. So right before the North fell. But it feels like the folklore of its era. It sounds like he's walking, he's talking, he's sewing you clothes, he's smelling things and going, ooh, that smells good. That's how God acts in the Bible sometimes. Can you thinking ahead to next week, part of the creation story where God is walking, talking, he's in the garden, right? Well, no, it's not. It's the other one. So when God shows up in the J source, God shows up. God doesn't send an angel. God doesn't send a vision. God doesn't send a messenger. God shows up. God hands you bread. That's the J source. So we say anthropomorphic, like a person. People in the J source have moral flaws. They try and they fail, and they try and they fail. And we don't make excuses for them in the J source. We don't say, well, but bless his heart, but he's a good guy. We don't do that in J. J's like, well, he was a moron, but he was our king. So that's just kind of how Jay does it. Jay's going to let people try and fail and not be great. But there's that epic, dramatic character. Like it's the narrative core of Genesis. There are themes of promise and fulfillment. God promises something. God fulfills God's promises. People try, people fail. God judges them. And then there's renewal. There's a theme of I am the creator and you are the created. The overarching theme of J is, you know what? People just fail and fail, but God is so trustworthy. God comes through for people when they fail over and over and over again. So that's the theme of J. Now, in the back of this notebook in your packet, there is actually a list of all these things we're going through on page 57. And there is a list somewhere in here. Can I do it with one hand? On page 65, you can actually go down the columns and you can read down that J column all the stories of J, all the verses that are ascribed to J through that most scholars agree on. And you'll kind of get this sense of this is who we're talking to. So what does J not do? Here's what J doesn't do. J does not care who your grandma was or who your son is. J never stops and say, and her name was Amanda. She was the daughter of Amy, daughter-in-law of Amy and Daryl, and we don't care who her parents were anymore. I mean, it doesn't tell us that. It doesn't tell us she was born in what's your birthday? Don't tell me. In the first day of May of the year of our, it doesn't, Jay does not care. Beta does not care. They are not here to tell us when something happened. They're here to tell us what happened and how God was faithful and how people were awful. Okay, so they do not tell you genealogical or chronological concerns. Now think of your reading. Did one of them seem to be more concerned with dates and names? Yes. One of them didn't even name Noah's children. And the other one said all their names, right? One of them told you in the month and the day of this, and then on the month and the day of this. And one of them was like, and then this happened. Which one you think is J, right? The one that does not care when it happens or whose grandfather you are. There is no concern with proper ritual in the J source. J is telling you the story. It is not telling you what the priest did properly according to the law. J does not care. So household leaders can make sacrifices in the J source. The priests beg to disagree. So if you see someone who is not a priest making a sacrifice, almost guaranteed that is the J source, because that's the only source that lets the household leaders make sacrifices and do proper ritual. J calls most local inhabitants Canaanites. You know those lists of like, and he was the father of the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hittites, the Moabites, the Jebusites. I can just go on and on. Jay's like, Canaanites. And they all are Canaanites. But Jay is not listing. They're not here for the records. Not here for the records. And Jay knows the desert as reality. So this is interesting. If I write a story from Marshfield and I have someone walking across the field, do you know what sound my character's shoes are going to make? Squish, 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 because I walk across a marsh field every day. And my feet go squish, squish, squish. You go out behind the ark, you will squish. Marsh field. We know a wetland reality here at the church. So if I write a story, it's going to go squish. If I write that story from Mongolia, nothing is going to go squish, because it's going to go grit, grit, grit from the sand under my feet. Jay knows the desert. Jay only knows the desert. Jay knows thirst. Jay knows famine. Jay knows that water only comes from one direction. Which direction does water come from in the desert? From above. It comes down. Okay? Not all the Bible stories know the desert is reality, because some of them were written by the rivers of Babylon. And they went squish and splash. And so they are very wet stories because they were writing them next to rivers. and you just change perspective by what you're living. You just change perspective by what it looks like. So if you're writing from down here and the nicest body of water around is the Dead Sea, you're going to have a pretty dry story. If you're over here in the cradle of civilization in Mesopotamia, you're going to write a pretty wet story. Water is going to come from up and water is going to come from down. Does that all make sense? And it's just one of those things you can't change. Where you're standing, that your story is going to do that. You know a wet world or a dry world. So just a few other things. The Yahweh source, Moses received the law on Mount Sinai, not on Mount Horeb. Joshua's mentioned. Aaron is okay. Like Aaron, Moses' brother, he's all right. He's all right. Okay. And they favor a unified state. So the thing about the J source is the J source is someone or some group of people writing down oral traditions that they had passed on for years and years and years in front of the campfires, right? They'd been sitting there telling their kids and their grandkids what mattered, where we came from. This is what we learned from God. This is what we believe that makes us different from the people around us, these Canaanites, right? That's what they've been doing. At some point, someone says, we might need to write these down. And we maybe writing them down will help us understand where we are now, socially and politically. So it's not a political act to sit down and write it. It's a theological act because they understood we're here because God put us here. God made us go through these things. God taught us these lessons. So we need to sit down and write. One of the hardest things for us to understand is that the Hebrew Bible is at the same time a theological work and a national history. It is the history of the nation of Judah. And to some extent, the history of the nation of Israel. And so they are writing their political and social history as well as the story because they are God's people. So the earliest written source probably finished before 722 BCE. So I have a chart that I make to teach Bible study. If you've taken any Bible studies with me, you have this memorized. It's on page 59. And so they're thinking that the story was written right here around the time the first temple was built, before Israel and Judah split into two separate kingdoms. But it had to be done before the first temple was destroyed and Israel falls to the Assyrians, because the source does not know that. It does not know Assyria. It does not know what this issue was. So it does seem to know David, unification, that sort of thing, but it doesn't know the later stuff. And so that's a good way of stopping. If I pick up a letter from one of my grandmothers and they're talking about current events, I can tell which grandmother that was, right? Based on where are they, what do they know, what do they not know? If they're talking about how silly it is to build spaceships because we're never, ever going to visit anywhere, you know it was written before July 1969, right? Because they didn't see man walk on the moon. You know what they don't know also, not just what they know. So this is the basic timeline. I use that all the time. We think it's written accounts of oral tradition, and it tells the story of the times before now. It's not me sitting at my desk going, okay, so this is what I know about ancient history. I'm going to write this down from 2025. It's let us tell you the stories that we know before the present, but it is a real mistake to call it history because history is a modern concept. If you go study history in college, first you have to take a class about what history is, what the study of history is, and why this is history and not this. right? History is a discipline. It has requirements of how we keep records and how we sign things and how we know what we know about the past. They did not have that. That is all modern. I mean, one of the biggest pushes I've had in my career is people saying, well, how do you know if Paul didn't write that letter? Well, he didn't sign them because they didn't sign them. And it was okay in that time for Paul Chaddick to write a letter as me because he knows who I am. You know, he didn't, that's not dishonest. It is now because we know of history. We have standards for when we sign documents, who signs documents, and who. None of this stuff was signed. So these stories are stories of the past that give our lives meaning and help us make sense of them. But when we demand that they are factual history, we are being so 20 and 21st century. 20 and 21st century. We are demanding that this ancient word of God meets our standards. Does that make sense? Until we went through sort of the scientific revolution, there wasn't a concept that the Bible had to be factually true. They understood the Bible during the Middle Ages metaphorically, and this is an allegory for this. And people were comfortable interpreting the Bible in different ways. And then when we started thinking about facts and science and reason and logic, I need proof. What's my proof? The Bible's my proof. If the Bible is God's revelation, then it is God's only revelation, and every word of it is revelation, and every word of the revelation must be true. True, 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 factually true. Ugh. That's not, that's so modern. But if you think about people who insist that the Bible must be taken literally, my Bible is factually true. I will contort myself in all these ways to make the contradictions work. Doesn't mean the Bible isn't factually true. It's that it doesn't matter. These are the stories God wants in the Bible. In the Bible, God inspired people to put into God's holy word, and those stories give our lives meaning. They give us purpose, and they tell us what God wants us to know. When we say, but is it fact? It's kind of modern and ugly. Right? To me. But who knows? I'm a snob. Okay. Any questions? Anybody ready to walk out? Okay, we're good. Ooh, we're doing good. Okay. So let's do Noah's Ark by source. And we're going to figure out which of our readings was written by Jay. So I would like you to break up and to talk to somebody near you. And I want you to think about the evidence for the two sources you were given. Which one of them is Jay? So is there any evidence that reading A is Jay, or any evidence that reading B is Jay? And if you'd like, I will give you a series of questions you can answer. Do you want this series of questions, or do you want to figure it out on your own? Questions. Okay. Oh, we'll see. So our question is, what direction does the rain fall? Figure that out. What direction does the water come from? What direction does the water come from? What are Noah's kids' names? What are Noah's kids' names? Does God seem a little human to you? That's another question. Does God seem a little human to you in this story? Are you getting any chronological information? Are you getting any dates? Not like John Gray, but other dates. Okay. We'll find you somebody. Who's sacrificing? Is anybody sacrificing anything? Oh yeah. Okay. And yeah, no, that's all the questions. All right, I'm gonna give you like 2 minutes to look that over and talk to a neighbor, but not Jason. Jason's already got it figured out.
I want you to figure out how you know.
And it's just sons and waters. No, then Noah built an altar to the Lord. Oh, right. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Ooh, yeah.
I don't want to do it to you, Ken. To be honest with you, I don't want to have to write it all out.
Because we're supposed to ask the questions of the being of them stories, yeah. Okay.
So, wait. God, oh God. Oh, all the springs of the great first forth. The water.
Yeah. Yeah. And then it's talking
You got
a
it.
lot about numbers, like how old Noah was.
Oh.
Yeah. What day it all happened.
The 600th year.
Like the first day of the first month in the 601st year. Very specific.
Well,
And then the name, Noah and his son.
well, the description is the well springs. So all the well springs of the waters that keep under the land blasting up, yeah. So all the wells that would normally get harbor, flocks and that kind of stuff just started gushing.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a very good, that's not a,
Like,
right, that's not.
Well springs are
so it did rain.
That's Babylon. It's a Babylon.
He does remember. Yeah. Yeah, that's written. Smells good.
I can totally relate to that. Taking in some of the bird offerings.
My impression when you look at that whole thing is that God loves the barbecue. When I was living in an apartment, some blessed soul was fried chicken. I had to have some, so I put chicken and I fried. I was like, my gosh, I have to have that right now.
This is interesting because I've gotten
Does
into
it mention
into
stuff
subject
about-
matter under the concept of two powers in heaven that Jewish scholars were beating their heads into the wall with. This was up to and into the second
But does it
temple
talk about, wait,
period.
does not eat that has
and
its life blood in
it
it?
was-
That seems like
It was
Pharisee
explicitly
law. Yeah, or priest law.
Yep.
called the heresy by the Rabbinic tradition that followed the exiles that the Romans kicked off. But there's this whole, two powers of heaven. They were always trying to wrestle with these notions as well.
Right.
That Yahweh is the seen, the God you can see without dying. Elohim is the God that you can't see.
Right.
Otherwise you'll die.
You have those activities
Okay, let's come back together if you would. Are we back on, Nick? Okay, so Jason makes an interesting point. He's talking about the way he ran into some of this information and being a debate in Jewish communities. So because I lived in a predominantly Jewish community when I was going to seminary, I have a different perspective on the Hebrew Bible. So I lived in a retirement hotel that was 60% Jewish. They loved it when I taught this stuff. They'd be like, please go to seminary and come home and teach us about the Bible from your Protestant perspective. It's so charming, you know. They thought it was helpful to them. So in the last 20 years, there are Jewish scholars who are working with Protestant scholars, and they are writing books using the perspective, this sort of documentary criticism. And I should have said early, criticism is not we're sitting around going, the Bible didn't do her hair right today. It's critical thinking, right? It's more critical thinking. So we call it documentary criticism. There's form criticism, sociological criticism, feminist criticism. There's all this kind of criticism, and people get their feathers ruffled about it, but we're not criticizing the Bible. We're not critiquing it. We're thinking about it critically. Oh, well, I know. Documentary analysis would be much better, but for some reason, you know how academic areas will just pick a word and make it mean something else, and then everybody else just has to not know what it means. That's what they've done. Of course it is. It's a good choice from the ivory tower, isn't it? I wish they hadn't done that to us. So anyway, there is this kind of interesting new thing. So there are a couple scholars who I can name that have really popular books. You can get them on Amazon. You can get them on Cokesbury usually. One of them is Mark Zvi Brettler, and he has a book called How to Read the Hebrew Bible, and it's thematic. Like he walks you through as a Jewish person, particularly talking to Protestants who want to understand the themes of the Bible. He writes that. And then Amy Jill Levine, and I've used some of her work. She's a Jewish scholar of Jesus. She's very interesting. So here's the beginning of Psalm 137. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there, we hung our lyres. For there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. Where is this happening? In Babylon. Is it wet or dry? Wet. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. That's the beginning of Psalm 137. That is a psalm written from a wetland about what it's like to remember home. So the exile is the period we'll be talking about next week, which is much later. The Assyrians come in, they take the north, they take Israel in 722. It's gone. Strangely, though, later we find these people called Samaritans walking around. Who are like us, but different. Okay, so they take the Israelites away. Some of them stay, eventually develop into Samaritans. Later, the Judeans will be, the Judahites will be taken away by the Babylonians. They will go to Babylon. They will be in exile, and there they will have lots of time on their hands. What a great time to write some stuff down, right? So one of the readings you had today was written by the rivers of Babylon, and one of them was written probably in Jerusalem. I want you to tell me, what is the evidence that reading A is the J source? The word Lord, L-O-R-D, is God. That's right. There is no family tree. No one has kids. And the water's coming down, only down, right? What else? Do we know when it happened? What year? What month? And at the end, is there a sacrifice? Yep. And Noah is able to make a sacrifice. He would not be able to do it if the priests were writing it. The priest would be like, "Ah, that is our job." Yep. All those things are very human, right? That's how a human acts. And so those things make a lot of sense. That is an ideal case for this being the A source. You didn't get any of the Southern, you didn't get some of the other aspects, the unified state, that sort of thing. But you picked up on the clues and you were successfully able to do what seminary students taking Hebrew Bible learned to do after a week of seminary. So you did good. You did good, right? For what that's worth. Okay, Ken had a question for us. So we're going to switch to the Ken view and have him ask our question.
My question is, when you're trying to identify these passages as from one source or another, is it possible that one of the sources maybe had an original writing, but then they got to, let's say, by the waters of Babylon at a certain time, and so the various sources got mixed together, and so there's a little bit of each source in sort of each version?
Some of the source... That's a good question. Okay, so the verses didn't come with it, right? This is chapter 7, verse 14. It didn't come with it. A French publisher was on horseback and had this idea and did it as he was writing, which is why some of our verses are this long and some of our verses are this long, right? And so so don't think those are sacred and mean anything to the sources. That's how a publisher marked off this thing for easier reading. It was a great idea. I wish he hadn't done it on horseback in a rush. I wish he'd sat down and thought about it a little bit better. But sometimes when you see those source things broken up, it will be like, maybe this clause is the source of the sentence. Like, it's not a whole sentence. We don't know if the first two were separate documents that then got mixed together by the next one and then remixed. We just know all of these voices are there. And we know that the last one seems to have put in the transition phrases and shuffled things. So if you'd like to see, this is one of my favorite things, how those stories, those two separate stories that you were able to tell as two completely separate stories, how those got put together. You can look on page 60. We will get to this in a future class. On page 62, that's how those two sources are combined. And they are a complete mirrored reflection, balancing 40 days, 150 days, Horeb, Sinai, like everything gets balanced together, but they're not all the same length. So we don't know if they went through and chopped up sentences and threw some of them away. I am glad, though, that they kept at least all of those sources, because I always think that, like with the Gospels, it makes it so much richer to know who Jesus is and who he said and what he meant, because we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I always think of it as like 4 people at the scene of an accident on different corners, and you see something happen. And if you get all 4 of those stories, you're going to have a richer understanding. So if we just had the J source, if we just had the P source, if we had just the D source, we would not love God. And if we just had the E source, well, we wouldn't, because they didn't have any power, or like it wouldn't have survived. So we have to have all those. There's a beauty in this symphony of voices, but we don't know specifically how they were put together. Later work, early 20th century, into the 21st century. They're working on trying to figure some of that stuff out. And of course, computer software helps with literary analysis, right? They can go through and analyze things. I'm glad I don't spend all my day doing that. I want to spend all day, every day teaching this to people who love God and want to be able to read the Bible for themselves, but find that maybe the Bible isn't the easiest book to read.
But I think knowing this is free.
I think so. I think so.
Like butting heads. Not butting heads.
Right. And we are a church that allows there to be multiple voices at every table, right? So it's easier for us to understand this maybe than someone that insisted it has to be literally this and this and this. It was 40 days and then 150 days and then 40 more days and then 7 days and 7 days and the bird was white and then it was black. I mean, he had different birds. He had like 7 birds. He had 7 pairs. He had 2 pairs. He had 1 pair. He had no pairs. He was sacrificing his pairs. Why is he sacrificing the pairs? Anyway, what I get out of the story is when the rainbow goes into the sky, that rainbow is to remind God not to destroy us. And we look at it and are like, oh, God won't destroy us. That's a reminder for me. No, God looks at it and it's like, can't destroy him today. I made a promise. So, that's like my favorite thing when you really read the Bible stories and you read them and you're able to kind of, okay, I don't need to separate this out to read it and appreciate it, but it does make it clearer. Now I can really read the story and I smile every time there's a rainbow because I'm like, God's up in heaven going, not today. So that's sort of my take on this. And as we go forward and go into next week, we'll learn a little bit more because you're going to go back and read the other story again. You're going to read the other story again. You'll notice there are some asterisks on that page. You're going to have to answer a question about what's between those asterisks. And next week, we'll get into the creation stories in 2 weeks. Sorry, it's next week's Mother's Day. So we're not having class in 2 weeks. Ken has a question. So we're flipping the camera to Ken.
I have a question. It is, what is the significance of the dove, the raven, and the swallow birds?
I have no idea. My guess would be there were doves in Jerusalem and maybe not in Babylon. Sometimes it's as easy, but I don't know. That's just me making stuff up. Though I don't know. I'll look it up. Was there a swallow in the story? Because he does a raven and then a swallow.
Then he sends a swallow and then he sends a raven who finally doesn't come back. I think it's because he found carrion, probably.
Or maybe he took the birds on the boat and then he's like, I can't get rid of all of them. I'm like, the doves are all going to die now. It could be that. But then he's like, well, it depends on which story it is, right? It's very weird knowing what their animals represented to them. I just always thought, what are they eating? Okay, did you notice that everyone was vegetarian until the story? Isn't that interesting? Yeah, he tells them the rules for eating meat. Now remember, these are prehistory stories. These are old stories. And he gives them the right to eat meat, but they have to account for it. And I thought about that all week. I had a burger and then I was like, do we need to talk? I mean, it made me think because that's different. Now, I have actually heard vegetarians and vegans use this to justify that this is like a more biblical lifestyle. I don't know. I'm sure they came along on every animal. And thank you for not asking me if there were any dinosaurs on the ark. I had that question last week. Chickens. Mm-hmm. And he didn't take any fish. Did you notice that? No need. Or clams? Or plants, right? Mm. Would it survive swampiness? It is. So, yes, and it's hard to tell because I don't know that calendar and I don't know how old Moses was. Also, months, days, that all gets really hard in a story like Hebrew, in the Hebrew Bible, because we didn't know how long a day was necessarily. We may not, or a month at least. We probably knew a day, one to the next. But how long is a month? How long is a year? All these things are going to be different. And it took time. These are really, really old stories. And so you have to kind of, in my opinion, loosen up and throw your calendar out a little bit, because it's going to be a different timing. I mean, day in Hebrew is period of time. It's not, and there was 24 hours and God got all this done and Jesus was standing there saying it was good. It's a little, whew, it's okay. It's okay, right? I think it's most helpful to just remember that when we need it to be factual, we're needing it to be something it was never intended to be. Right? So I'm not going to call it a myth, but I'm not going to roll your eyes if you say that. Okay? All right. Thank you for coming to Bible study. I have been glad to have you. I hope you come back next week because the flood story is so fun. 2 weeks. But the flood story is also more fundamental to people's personal faith. Like, you don't get mad if I'm like, hey, there's 2 flood stories mixed together. But if you do the creation story, sometimes that's somebody's sacred cow. We barbecue those per God's instructions. So we will be barbecuing the sacred cows of the creation story in 2 weeks on May 18th. Right? See you later. Ciao.